When we talk about the Russo-Ukraine war, a lot of analysts have been saying that we're currently in phase three of the conflict, which is a series of large-scale Ukrainian counteroffensives, and it seems very much that they've gained the initiative and have driven back Russia in the north, northeast, and to a lesser extent the south and the east of the country. To a lot of people, it looked like the war had decisively turned in the Ukraine's favor and that Russia was on the ropes. The referendum and the decision to mobilize hundreds of thousands of more soldiers also spoke to the narrative that Russia was in critical trouble. That being said, I think the situation on the ground is more complicated, and I think we're going to see a bunch of different interrelated things come together to see perhaps another reversal in this war. So, first and foremost, while the Russians did certainly lose the strategic initiative, and they did get pushed back, the pro Russian argument, which is probably mostly true, is most of the territory they gave up was territory that was simply not defensible. It was wide open, the front line was way too long, the Russians couldn't adequately defend it, so rather than risk being encircled, they decided to fall back to rivers and other natural choke points and consolidate their front. So Ukraine wouldn't be able to bring its larger numbers to bear. So I think the Russian army has suffered a lot of losses, but I don't think the situation of them losing that amount of territory necessarily corresponds to a similar blow to their military capacity. Now, I've seen some people argue that they lost a ton of ammunition as they were withdrawing and were unable to blow it up, but I've only seen that in one or two sources. So the actual amount of equipment that they were able to take away is kind of an open question. And this brings us to one of the most contentious issues in the entire war, which is how big are the respective armies and what are the actual losses that they've taken. So whenever you're talking about military strength, you have to keep in mind that the total size of a nation's armed forces is to a certain extent irrelevant, because most of the armed forces are not frontline combat troops. They're people who do garrison duty, who maintain the various equipment, who provide logistical support, who do administrative work, that sort of thing. So you might have an army that's like 1 million people, but of those, only maybe 200,000 or so are actual combat troops. I tend to use the term field army to refer to a large mobile group of soldiers that can be used for offensives, having the logistical support and supplies in order to carry out large-scale operations. This concept kind of dates back to the late Roman Empire, where you had the Limitanii and the Comitatenses, wherein the Limitanii were settler soldiers whose job was to garrison the frontier, and basically there was enough of them and they were well equipped enough to delay advances into Roman territory and to provide kind of an early warning system. But it was the Comitenses who would come in and serve as the field army, and they were much better equipped, they had better logistics, they were better trained, and when it came down to an actual fight, they could basically just blow through whatever got in their way. And I think that's very much the case in Ukraine. Now, the Ukrainians, theoretically, I have seen so many different estimates, so sorry if these numbers I'm going to come up with are somewhat arbitrary. The Ukraine might have a total armed force of maybe 1 million people to 2 million people, but in terms of the actual number of properly trained, properly equipped soldiers in a field army that could launch offensives, it's probably only a small number of those. I would tend to say, rather than giving an exact number, I think the Ukrainian field army is probably about 30 to 50% larger than Russia's. They certainly do have a larger army, and they've been able to take advantage of that, particularly exploiting the fact that the Russian front was very long, and they couldn't adequately defend all of it. I don't think it's overwhelming, though. The remainder of their army does things like defensive operations and garrison duties and that kind of thing. The Ukrainians also have the advantage that they don't really have to worry about occupying ground that they retake, at least in most parts of the country, wherein the Russians have to maintain basically military control of whatever ground they take, outside of obviously the pro-Russian areas in the Ukraine and the Donbass. Most of the Ukrainian army is probably either logistics, garrison troops, or light infantry. Now, the thing with light infantry is you can't really use them for offensives, but if they dig in an urban setting or through trench warfare, and you give them rifles and anti tank weapons, they can actually perform pretty well in the defensive because it takes away a lot of the additional variables that come with launching offensive operations. So, like I said, I think the Ukrainian field army is probably about 30 to 50% the size of the Russian one. In terms of kill to death ratio, I've heard anything from the Russians losing more people to the Ukrainians losing 5-1. I would guess that given their superiority in terms of firepower and the fact that they're not relying as much on hastily drawn up conscripts. A lot of the Russian army is conscripted. I don't think they're as poorly trained, though, as a lot of what the Ukraine has been forcing into the field. It's probably 2 to 3 to 1 at a minimum. I'd probably go so far as to say it's probably 3 Ukrainian soldiers die for every Russian soldier. And that's kind of why the war's been in something of a stalemate, where the Russians have a moderate qualitative advantage. The Ukrainians have a moderate quantitative advantage. And this has been kind of obscured because the West has been giving the Ukraine so many advanced weapon systems to supplement their military. But how is that going exactly? I've seen a lot of articles, even by Western sources, that say that most Western countries are running out of stuff to send to the Ukraine, that it's going to take years and years for countries to replenish their normal stocks, let alone produce anything else to send to the Ukraine. I think I saw some estimates that it's going to take about 5 or 6 years for the US to replenish its Javelin supplies. The industry in a lot of these countries is designed to suck up a lot of money. It's not really designed for mass production. I've seen different estimates as to how effective Russia's arms industry is, particularly with regards to the sanctions that have blocked off a lot of electronic components and other things they need for more advanced weapon systems. I think they are pretty set, though, in terms of producing things like artillery shells, normal bombs, rifles, munitions, and that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, if you have virtually limitless artillery shells, artillery, as Joseph Stalin put it, is the god of war. Russia also has immense reserves of ammunition and other weapon systems left over from the Soviet Union. While they may not be necessarily the most modern, once again, if you have a lot of big guns firing big shells, you're probably going to hit something and you're probably going to take out a lot of enemies. So the Ukraine has largely exhausted, from my understanding, its own military supplies. The offensive was undertaken largely using donations from the West, but the West does not really have that much more to give. They can give all the money in the world to the Ukraine. If there's no weapon systems that they can buy because they've already been used up, then it doesn't really matter at this point in time. I saw someone criticizing Russia for trying to buy artillery shells from North Korea, and this as evidence that Russia has run out of ammunition themselves. Well, this is possible. It's also likely that Russia might just be trying to increase its stockpiles in preparation for there being a longer conflict. Definitely when it comes to munitions, tanks, and stuff like that, I think while the Ukraine might have enjoyed a temporary advantage due to more advanced Western systems, they're probably going to start running out of spare parts and ammunition for a lot of them relatively soon. And Russia's in a much better position to sustain its war effort and make good on whatever its vehicle losses were. And hopefully you can kind of start to see where I'm going to be going with this. Now, we enter into this Putin's partial mobilization of something like 300,000 Russians. Now, if we assume that this is the best I can determine, that the Russians have a field army of around maybe 120 to 140,000 people. I've seen lower estimates and I've seen higher estimates. And Ukraine has maybe 160 to 180,000 people in their field armies. An influx of even 100,000 more Russian troops will dramatically alter the balance of power. Um, you might see once they start arriving in large numbers, Russia's not going to have the same issue with holding the front line anymore. It's not going to have the same issue where the Ukrainians can use their larger numbers to cut them off and encircle them. They might be in a position to go on the offensive once again. And a critical part of that is, like I said, the Ukrainians may very well have blown through most of their best weapons and best men in this series of offensives, and they might be exhausted, whereas Russia has been able to shorten its supply lines and is bringing in fresh men. Something else to keep in mind is a lot of the Ukraine is a swamp or farmland. Tanks are very particular in terms of what kind of terrain they like. Soft terrain is very bad for tanks, whereas frozen terrain, from my understanding, is good for tanks. So Russia might be in a good position to launch a mechanized offensive. I mean, they did launch the initial invasion in February. Once the ground freezes in Ukraine, and they don't have to worry about their trucks and tanks getting bogged down in the mud. So I think what's kind of coming together, the Ukraine running out of weapons and ammunition, Russia bringing in a massive increase in its number of soldiers, and winter hints at a large Russian offensive that'll begin at some point in late November in the next couple of months. I also think that Putin has to make significant progress on this war and before the 1 year anniversary happens, or it's going to look very politically bad. Now, there is another thing to keep in mind that I think also plays into the idea that there's going to be a winter offensive. Russia has switched to attacking a lot of Ukrainian infrastructure, things like water, electricity, gas, that sort of thing. Now, what this is bad at the immediate time, but as we head into winter, it's going to dramatically impact the ability of the Ukraine to function and to resist the Russian advance. You're going to have large numbers of people who are cold. They won't be able to provide proper heat and electricity to their armed forces. Whereas even though the Russian areas have also been devastated, they have the rest of their country that they can draw upon for resources to bring to bear. So Ukraine's going to be an even worse situation come winter. There's also the possibility, I've heard rumors that Russia's tried to bat phone Belarus into joining. If Belarus joins the war, that's a whole other front that's going to open up. And maybe the idea here is they're just going to be hitting the Ukraine with a bunch of different strategic disadvantages at once, and it might be enough for them to regain the momentum and to kind of turn this war around. That being said, I still don't know if Russia's really going to have the troops to occupy a majority of the Ukraine, or if they're going to go back to what I think their original strategy was of just trying to cause the Ukrainian government to collapse through sheer weight of numbers and devastation. It kind of remains anybody's game, but I think if you don't see a large scale offensive this winter, Putin's political position is going to start getting worse and worse. I don't think it's really liberals who are going to be going after him. I think a lot of nationalists and people further to the right of him are kind of irritated with how this war's been going, and they feel like they should have won by now, or it shouldn't be in a situation where they're repeatedly getting humiliated. But that's something I don't think we're going to see until spring. In the meantime, I would be very surprised if we don't see a major Russian offensive in the next couple months. I could be wrong, though. I mean, this whole war is nothing if not an exercise in the fog of war and how difficult it can be to read people's motivations.